They forgot my birthday again, so I sent them a calendar with just one date marked, never again. I used to count the days until my birthday every year, hoping for at least one sign that I mattered. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Eleanor Matthews, and I'm 68 years old. I live in a 3-bedroom house in suburban Chicago, the same house where I raised my son David, where I hosted countless family dinners, where I believed I was building a legacy of love that would last forever. This morning, March 8th, I woke up in my empty bedroom at 6:30 a.m., just like I have every morning for the past 40 years. The alarm clock's red digits glowed in the darkness, and for a moment, I felt that familiar flutter of anticipation in my chest. Today was my birthday. Surely today would be different. I sat on the edge of my bed, my feet touching the cold hardwood floor, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for that cheerful, "Happy birthday, Mom," that every mother dreams of hearing. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of the heating system and the distant sound of morning traffic on Maple Street. I made my way to the kitchen, my slippers shuffling against the floor. The kitchen still smelled faintly of yesterday's pot roast, the one I'd made for David and his wife Lisa, even though they barely touched it. They'd sat at my dining table, Lisa scrolling through her phone while David talked about work, neither of them really seeing me, neither of them remembering what today meant. I brewed my coffee in the same ceramic mug I'd used for 20 years, the one with tiny roses painted around the rim, that was now faded from countless washes. As I stirred in the cream, I found myself staring at the kitchen calendar hanging crooked on the wall near the refrigerator. It still showed January, 3 months out of date. Nobody had bothered to turn the pages. March 8th wasn't circled. There was no reminder, no note, nothing to indicate that this day held any significance at all. The coffee tasted bitter, or maybe that was just the taste of disappointment settling on my tongue. By 10 a.m., my phone hadn't rung once. I checked it obsessively, making sure the ringer was on, that I hadn't missed any messages. The screen remained blank. No calls, no texts, no Facebook notifications, nothing. I walked through the house, touching familiar objects as if they could provide the comfort that human connection had failed to give me. The framed photograph on the mantelpiece showing David's college graduation. I'd driven 8 hours to be there, had saved for months to buy him that expensive watch he'd wanted. His smile was radiant in that picture, his arm around my shoulders, both of us believing in a future filled with shared celebrations and mutual care. That watch now sits in his jewelry box, probably forgotten, just like the woman who gave it to him. By noon, the silence had become deafening. I found myself standing in the living room, looking out the window at Mrs. Henderson next door watering her garden. Her daughter visits every Sunday with the grandchildren. I can hear their laughter through the walls sometimes. The sound of a family that chooses to be together rather than one that simply tolerates each other's existence. I made myself a sandwich, turkey and Swiss on white bread, and ate it standing at the kitchen counter. Each bite felt mechanical, flavorless. Food for fuel, nothing more. There was no one to share it with. No one to ask how my day was going. No one to remember that birthdays used to be special in this house. The afternoon stretched endlessly. I tried reading, but the words blurred together. I tried watching television, but every commercial seemed to feature happy families celebrating birthdays with balloons and cake and genuine smiles. I turned it off and sat in the quiet, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway tick away the hours of what should have been my special day. At 3 p.m., I did something I hadn't done in years. I called David. "Hi, Mom." His voice was distracted, distant. I could hear typing in the background. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice carefully bright. "How's your day going?" "Busy, really busy. Can I call you back later?" The line went dead before I could say another word, before I could remind him what day it was, before I could ask for just 5 minutes of his time, just one moment of acknowledgement that I existed, that I mattered, that the woman who had given him life deserved at least a happy birthday. I held the phone long after the dial tone began, my hands trembling slightly. The silence felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. That evening, I sat at my dining table with a store-bought cupcake, a single candle flickering in the darkness. I'd bought it for myself at the grocery store, had asked the teenage cashier to wish me happy birthday because I needed to hear those words from someone, anyone, even a stranger who was paid to be polite. As I sat there looking at that sad little cupcake, I realized something that cut deeper than any deliberate cruelty could have. They hadn't forgotten my birthday out of malice or anger. They had forgotten because I simply didn't matter enough to remember. In their busy, important lives, I had become invisible. I blew out the candle without making a wish. What was the point? The only thing I wanted, to be loved, to be remembered, to be valued, seemed as unreachable as the stars outside my window. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart breaking in ways I didn't know were possible. Tomorrow, I would wake up and pretend this day hadn't happened. I would continue cooking their meals, cleaning their messes, being available whenever they needed something. But deep inside, something fundamental had shifted. A seed of anger, small but fierce, had taken root in the garden of my disappointment. I didn't know it yet, but that tiny seed would soon grow into something that would change everything. March 8th, the day I realized I had been living as a ghost in my own life. March 8th, the day everything began to unravel. March 8th, the day that would become my liberation. The morning after my forgotten birthday, I woke up with a strange clarity, as if the fog of denial had finally lifted. I found myself remembering things I'd pushed down for years, moments when I should have seen the pattern forming, signs I'd ignored because I wanted so desperately to believe in the love I thought we shared. I made my coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking through the photo albums I kept in the drawer, albums that told the story of a woman who had given everything and received so little in return. There was David at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the bicycle I'd saved 6 months to buy him. I'd worked double shifts at the diner to afford it, my feet aching and my back screaming. But his joy had made every painful hour worth it, or so I thought. Here was his high school graduation. I'd taken out a loan to buy him that class ring he wanted so badly. The one with his birthstone that cost more than I made in a month. He'd worn it exactly twice before forgetting it in a gym locker. College tuition, $23,000 my first year, $25,000 the second, climbing every semester until the total reached numbers that still made my stomach clench. I'd mortgaged the house, this house where I now sat alone, to pay for his education. It's an investment in his future, I'd told myself, our future. When David brought Lisa home for the first time, I'd renovated the guest room, painted it soft yellow, bought new furniture so she'd feel welcome. I'd cooked her favorite meals, learned to make her grandmother's potato salad recipe, pretended to enjoy the wine she brought even though it tasted like vinegar to me. Their wedding cost me another $15,000. I'd wanted to give them something beautiful, something perfect. The flowers alone cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, but I'd smiled and signed the checks, believing I was buying my place in their new life together. I remembered the night David called to tell me they'd bought their first house. "It's perfect, Mom," he'd said, his voice bright with excitement. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a big yard for when we have kids. What he didn't say was that they'd needed money for the down payment. What he didn't say was that my retirement savings, the money I'd scraped together from 40 years of working at the diner, would disappear into their dream. "It's just a loan," Lisa had said when she came to pick up the check. "We'll pay you back as soon as David gets promoted." That was 7 years ago. I'd never seen a penny of it returned, and after the first year, they'd stopped mentioning it entirely. When their first child was born, my grandson Tommy, I'd been so grateful to be included that I'd ignored the warning signs. Lisa called me to babysit, never to visit. David brought Tommy over when they needed a free babysitter, never just to see his grandmother. I'd cherished those moments anyway, reading stories to Tommy, teaching him to bake cookies, watching his face light up when I pulled his favorite dinosaur book from the shelf. But even those precious hours came with conditions, schedules, limitations. Don't give him sugar after 6. Make sure he naps for exactly 90 minutes. Don't let him watch more than 30 minutes of television. A list of rules for loving my own grandson, as if my decades of mothering experience meant nothing. Then came the requests that weren't really requests at all. Mom, could you watch Tommy this weekend? Lisa's sister is getting married and we can't find a sitter. Could you? As if I had a choice. As if saying no was even an option for a grandmother who wanted to remain in her grandson's life. Mom, our washing machine broke and we can't afford to fix it right now. Could we bring our laundry over? Could we? Followed by garbage bags full of clothes that multiplied until my weekend was consumed with washing, drying, folding their entire family's wardrobe. Mom, Lisa's car is in the shop. Could you drive Tommy to soccer practice this week? Soccer practice became every practice, every game, every team party. My Saturday mornings belonged to them now, my own plans secondary to their convenience. I'd started keeping a mental tally, though I hated myself for it. $5,000 for the car repair when David's transmission died. $3,000 when Lisa needed emergency dental work. $2,000 here, $1,500 there. Small amounts that seemed reasonable in isolation, but added up to a fortune I couldn't afford to give. Each time, they'd promised to pay me back. Each time, life would get in the way. David's promotion got delayed. Lisa decided to go back to school. The house needed a new roof. There was always something more important than repaying the woman who'd sacrificed her security for their comfort. But the money wasn't the worst part. Money could be earned again. Savings could be rebuilt. The worst part was the slow, systematic erosion of my dignity. It started with small things. Lisa correcting me in front of Tommy. Actually, Eleanor, we don't do timeouts anymore. We use positive reinforcement. As if I'd raised my child incorrectly. As if my methods were outdated and harmful. David would sigh when I called, his voice taking on that patient tone people use with elderly relatives they find burdensome. What is it, Mom? I'm kind of busy right now. Busy was always his default state when it came to me, though he had hours to discuss fantasy football with his friends. Family dinners became exercises in endurance. Lisa would spend the entire meal on her phone, responding to work emails or texting friends. David would talk about his job, his stress, his problems, while I sat silent, my own life apparently too insignificant to warrant discussion. When I tried to share news, a book I'd enjoyed, a conversation with a neighbor, a story about my day, their eyes would glaze over with barely concealed boredom. That's nice, Mom, they'd say, already mentally moving on to more important topics. The isolation crept in gradually. Old friends stopped calling because I was always busy with family obligations. I'd skip book club to babysit Tommy, miss church gatherings to cook Sunday dinner for people who barely noticed the effort I put into their favorite meals. My world shrank until it revolved entirely around their needs, their schedules, their convenience. I became a supporting character in my own life, existing solely to serve others who couldn't be bothered to remember my birthday. Sitting at my kitchen table with those photo albums spread before me, I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Every picture told the same story. Eleanor giving, Eleanor serving, Eleanor sacrificing, while others took and took and took until there was nothing left but an empty shell of a woman who'd forgotten what it felt like to matter. The coffee had grown cold in my hands, but I didn't notice. I was too busy grieving for the woman I used to be. The one who'd had dreams of her own, plans that didn't revolve around other people's happiness. I thought about my sister Margaret, who'd moved to Arizona with her husband after retirement. "Come visit," she'd said every Christmas card. "We have a guest room and plenty of sunshine." But I couldn't leave. Who would take care of David? Who would babysit Tommy? Who would be available when they needed me? Margaret sent pictures of herself hiking, taking art classes, traveling with friends she'd met in her retirement community. She looked vibrant, alive, free. Meanwhile, I was trapped in a house that felt more like a service station than a home, always ready to provide whatever was needed, but never receiving anything in return. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had spent so many years trying to buy love that I'd forgotten love couldn't be purchased. Real love was freely given, not extracted through guilt or manipulation or the fear of abandonment. Was I used? The question formed itself clearly in my mind for the first time. Had I been nothing more than a convenient resource to be depleted? A bank account with legs? A babysitter who worked for free? A housekeeper who paid for the privilege of serving? The answer sat heavy in my chest. Too painful to acknowledge, but too obvious to deny. Yes, I had been used. Systematically, thoroughly, completely used until there was almost nothing left of the woman I used to be. But sitting there in my empty kitchen, surrounded by photographs of a lifetime spent giving to people who couldn't remember my birthday, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The faint stirring of anger, and anger I was about to learn could be the first step toward finding myself again. The weeks following my birthday passed in a haze of small cruelties that cut deeper than any dramatic confrontation ever could have. It wasn't one devastating blow that broke me. It was the accumulation of tiny indignities, the death by 1,000 paper cuts that taught me exactly how little I meant to the people I loved most. 3 days after my forgotten birthday, Tommy had a soccer game. I'd been driving him to practice twice a week for 8 months, had never missed a single game, cheering from the sidelines while other grandparents sat beside their own children, included in family conversations I was never part of. I arrived early, as always, with my folding chair and thermos of hot chocolate for Tommy. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and that particular optimism that comes with youth and possibility. I found my usual spot along the sideline, away from the cluster of parents but close enough to call encouragement to my grandson. David and Lisa arrived 15 minutes late, rushing across the field with coffee cups from Starbucks, coffee that cost more than I spent on groceries in a day. They set up their chairs 20 feet away from mine, close enough that I could hear their conversation, but far enough to make it clear that I wasn't invited to join. "Did you remember to tell your mom about next weekend?" Lisa asked, her voice carrying that particular tone wives use when discussing burdensome relatives. "What about next weekend?" David replied, distracted, watching Tommy on the field. "The anniversary party. For your colleagues. We need her to watch Tommy overnight." My heart constricted. Not, would Eleanor be available? Or, should we ask if she has plans? Just the assumption that I would be ready and willing to rearrange my life for their convenience, as I always was. "Oh, right," David said. "I'll call her later." Later. As if I wasn't sitting 15 feet away. As if I was so invisible that they could discuss me like I wasn't even present. I wanted to stand up, to walk over and remind them that I was right here, that I had ears and feelings, and perhaps even plans of my own. Instead, I sat silent, gripping my thermos until my knuckles turned white, watching my grandson play soccer while his parents planned to use me like an unpaid service. The call came that evening, exactly as predicted. "Hey, Mom." David's voice carried that forced cheerfulness he used when he needed something. "How was your day?" Small talk. Pleasantries. Building up to the real purpose of his call. "Lisa and I have this work thing on Saturday. Could you watch Tommy overnight? He loves staying at Grandma's house." He loves staying at Grandma's house. The lie was so casual, so practiced, that I almost believed it myself. Tommy tolerated staying at my house because his parents required it, not because he enjoyed my company. He spent most of his time playing video games or asking when Mom and Dad were coming back. "Of course," I heard myself say, the words automatic, trained into me by decades of saying yes to everything they asked. But as I hung up the phone, I realized something that made my stomach turn. They hadn't asked. They had simply assumed. There was no, "Would you be able to?" or, "Do you have any plans?" There was only the expectation that I would drop everything, as I always did, to serve their needs. 2 weeks later, I got sick. Not seriously, just a spring cold that left me congested and exhausted. The kind of minor illness that requires rest and care, and maybe a bowl of soup from someone who loves you. I called David on Tuesday morning, my voice hoarse and scratchy. "I'm not feeling well," I told him. "I think I'm coming down with something." "That's too bad, Mom," he said, his attention clearly elsewhere. "You should drink plenty of fluids and get some rest." Practical advice delivered with the emotional warmth of a medical textbook. No offer to bring me soup. No suggestion that they check on me. No concern beyond the polite minimum required by social convention. By Thursday, I hadn't heard from anyone. No calls asking how I was feeling. No texts checking if I needed anything from the store. I could have been lying on my bathroom floor for 3 days and they wouldn't have known. That evening, my doorbell rang. For a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe David had come to check on me after all. Maybe someone cared enough to see if I was okay. It was Lisa, standing on my doorstep with a grocery bag in her arms. "Hi, Eleanor," she said, already stepping inside without being invited. "I hope you're feeling better. Could you watch Tommy tomorrow night? David's work is having this team-building thing at a bowling alley, and we can't find a babysitter." I stared at her, my head still fuzzy with congestion, unable to process what I was hearing. I'd been sick for 4 days without a single inquiry about my well-being, but the moment they needed a babysitter, my health was suddenly relevant again. "I'm still not feeling great," I said weakly. "Oh, you'll be fine," Lisa said with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never been denied anything she wanted. "Tommy's easy. He'll probably just watch TV and go to bed early. You won't even need to do anything. You won't even need to do anything." As if caring for a 7-year-old while fighting a cold was effortless, as if my illness was a minor inconvenience that shouldn't interfere with their social plans. I wanted to say no. The word sat on my tongue, heavy and foreign, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. But the lifetime habit of saying yes was stronger than my exhaustion, stronger than my resentment, stronger than the voice in my head that whispered this wasn't fair. "Okay?" I whispered. Lisa smiled and kissed my cheek, the first physical affection she'd shown me in months, and it was a reward for compliance. The pattern became impossible to ignore after that. I existed only when they needed something. I was visible only as a resource to be utilized. Between their requests, I was a ghost in my own life, haunting the edges of their busy, important world. Mother's Day came 6 weeks later. I woke up that Sunday morning with the familiar flutter of hope in my chest, despite everything. Surely on Mother's Day, they would remember. Surely the woman who had given David life, who had raised him alone after his father left, who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. Surely she deserved acknowledgement on this one day. I spent the morning cleaning house, preparing lunch just in case they decided to visit. I made David's favorite pot roast, baked the apple pie that always made him smile, set the table with my good china and fresh flowers from the garden. Noon came and went. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. At 3:30, my phone finally rang. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom." David's voice was bright and rushed. "Sorry I'm calling so late. We went to brunch with Lisa's family, and it ran longer than expected." Lisa's family. On Mother's Day, my son had chosen to celebrate with his wife's mother, not his own. I was an afterthought. A phone call squeezed in between more important obligations. "We're going to stop by later," he continued. "Tommy made you a card at school." They arrived at 6 o'clock, stayed for exactly 37 minutes. Tommy handed me a construction paper card with Happy Mother's Day, written in crayon, clearly made at his teacher's insistence rather than any genuine desire to honor his grandmother. Lisa stayed in the car, texting on her phone. David ate a slice of pie standing at the counter, already mentally preparing to leave. "Great pie, Mom," he said, kissing my forehead with the same perfunctory affection he might show a distant aunt. "We should get going, though. Early day tomorrow." After they left, I sat at my dining table, looking at the elaborate meal I'd prepared for people who couldn't spare an hour of their Mother's Day for the woman who had made their lives possible. That night, I made a decision that terrified me. I didn't clean up the dishes. I left them sitting on the table, the good china with its delicate rose pattern, the crystal glasses I only used for special occasions, the silver serving pieces that had been my mother's. For the first time in my adult life, I went to bed with a messy kitchen. It was a small rebellion, insignificant to anyone else. But for me, it was revolutionary. For me, it was the first crack in the perfect facade of Eleanor the selfless mother, Eleanor the reliable grandmother, Eleanor the woman who never complained and never said no. I lay in bed that night, listening to the grandfather clock chime the hours, and felt something dangerous stirring in my chest. Not just anger anymore, but something fiercer. Something that felt almost like self-preservation. The next morning, when I woke up and saw those dirty dishes still sitting on my dining room table, I didn't feel guilty. I felt free. And that freedom, small as it was, scared me more than anything else that had happened in my 68 years of life. The dirty dishes sat on my dining room table for 3 days. Each morning, I'd walk past them, feeling a mixture of guilt and defiance that grew stronger with each passing hour. On the fourth day, I finally washed them, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. The perfect facade of Eleanor the accommodating mother had cracked, and through that crack, light was beginning to seep in. It was during one of these small rebellions that inspiration struck me like lightning. I was standing in my kitchen, looking at the wall calendar that still showed January, when the idea formed with crystalline clarity. I drove to the office supply store on Ashland Avenue, my hands trembling slightly as I selected a brand new wall calendar. The cover showed a peaceful garden scene, ironic, considering what I was planning to do with it. At the checkout counter, I also bought a thick black marker, the kind used for making signs that couldn't be ignored. Back home, I spread the calendar open on my kitchen table. Page by page, I left every single day blank. Every birthday, every holiday, every anniversary. Nothing. The pages looked stark and empty, like my life had become. But March 8th was different. On March 8th, I wrote in bold black letters, "Never again." Below that, I circled the date and added, "The day I stopped waiting for love that never came." I packaged the calendar carefully, along with a note written on my best stationery, "So you never forget the day you lost me." The next morning, I drove to David and Lisa's house in their upscale neighborhood, where the lawns were perfectly manicured and the driveways held cars that cost more than I'd made in years. I left the package on their doorstep and drove away without looking back. The call came 2 hours later. "Mom, what the hell is this supposed to mean?" David's voice was sharp, angry, confused. I could hear Lisa in the background, her voice high and indignant. "Is she having some kind of breakdown?" "It means exactly what it says," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "March 8th was the day you forgot my birthday. It was also the day I realized I've been invisible to you for years." "Mom, that's ridiculous. We didn't forget your birthday. We've been busy, but..." "When is my birthday, David?" Silence stretched across the phone line like an accusation. "When is my birthday?" I repeated. March something. The 8th? 10th? He was guessing. My own son was guessing at the date I'd brought him into the world. The day I'd held him for the first time and promised to love him forever. "March 8th, I said quietly. "I've had 68 birthdays, David. You've forgotten the last 5. Mom, look, I'm sorry about the birthday thing, but this calendar is just... It's dramatic. It's manipulative. Manipulative. The word hit me like a slap. I was being accused of manipulation by a man who'd spent years using my love against me, who called only when he needed something, who treated me like an unpaid service rather than the woman who'd raised him. "You're right," I said. "It is dramatic. Because sometimes dramatic gestures are the only way to get people's attention when you've been invisible for so long." Lisa grabbed the phone. "Eleanor, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but this victim act needs to stop. We have our own lives to live. We can't be expected to remember every little thing. Every little thing. My birthday was a little thing." "You remember Tommy's birthday?" I said. "Well, of course we do. He's our son. And I'm David's mother." The logic was so simple, so devastating, that it left Lisa speechless for a moment. "That's different," she finally said. But her voice had lost its edge. "How? How is it different?" Another silence. Then Lisa's voice, harder now. "You know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe we should all just take some space, figure things out." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen, holding the silent phone, and waited for the familiar panic to set in. The fear of abandonment that had driven me to accept every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being taken for granted. But the panic didn't come. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time in my adult life, I had set a boundary. I had said, "This is not acceptable," and meant it. The silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I took a long, hot bath in the middle of the day. I lit candles, used the expensive bath salts I'd been saving for a special occasion, and lay in the warm water until my fingers pruned. There was no one to cook for, no one to clean up after, no phone calls demanding my immediate availability. The silence of my house no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. That evening, my phone rang again. This time it was Tommy. And my heart leapt with hope. Maybe the children could see what the adults had missed. Maybe innocence would cut through the selfishness that had poisoned my relationship with his parents. Grandma Eleanor? His 7-year-old voice was uncertain, coached. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. My voice warmed despite everything. "Mom and Dad said you're mad at us. They said you sent a mean calendar." I closed my eyes, feeling the manipulation even in this conversation with a child. They'd used my grandson as a weapon, teaching him to see my pain as anger, my boundary as meanness. "I'm not mad, Tommy," I said carefully. "I'm sad. Sometimes grown-ups get their feelings hurt when people they love forget important things. Like birthdays? Like birthdays. I'm sorry we forgot your birthday, Grandma." The simple honesty in his voice nearly broke me. Here was the apology I'd been waiting for, and it came from the one person who wasn't actually responsible for the hurt. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me. Are you still going to be my grandma?" The question pierced my heart. At 7 years old, Tommy was already learning that love could be conditional, that relationships could end when people didn't behave the way others wanted them to. "I will always be your grandma," I told him. "Always. That never changes. Even if Mom and Dad are mad? Even then." After I hung up, I sat in my living room and really looked at it for the first time in years. The furniture I'd chosen with care, the photos I'd arranged with love, the books I'd been meaning to read but never had time for because I was always available for someone else's needs. This was my home. These were my things. This was my life. And for the first time since I could remember, I was living it for myself. The calendar had been more than a message to my family. It had been a declaration of independence from a woman who'd forgotten she had the right to be treated with dignity and respect. March 8th had indeed been a day I'd never forget, but not because of what they'd failed to do, because of what I'd finally found the courage to do. I picked up one of my unread books, settled into my favorite chair, and began to read. Outside, the evening was quiet and still. Inside, something new was beginning, something that belonged entirely to me. The silence that followed my calendar gesture lasted exactly 1 week. 7 days of no phone calls, no requests for babysitting, no presumptions about my availability. 7 days of the most peaceful existence I'd had in years. I began to understand what my life might feel like if I wasn't constantly on call for other people's needs. On the 8th day, the assault began. It started with David showing up at my door unannounced, something he never did unless he needed something urgent. But this time, his face held an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of confusion, anger, and something that looked almost like fear. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room. "This whole thing has gone too far." I followed him, noting how he'd claimed my space without invitation, just like he'd claimed everything else in my life. "What thing?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. This tantrum, this rebellion, or whatever you want to call it. "Lisa's been getting calls from the neighborhood. Mrs. Peterson asked her if you were having some kind of breakdown. You can't just send weird packages to people and expect them to understand what you're trying to say." I almost laughed. After years of their subtle and not-so-subtle dismissals, now they were concerned about what the neighbors thought. "I sent you a calendar, David, with a message. A very clear message. A crazy message. Never again? What does that even mean? Never again what?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. When had his eyes become so cold? When had his voice taken on that patronizing tone he used when talking to people he considered intellectually inferior? "Never again will I accept being forgotten," I said quietly. "Never again will I pretend it doesn't hurt when my own family treats me like I'm invisible. Mom, you're being dramatic." "So we forgot your birthday. It happens. People get busy. You can't hold a grudge forever over one mistake." One mistake? As if the forgotten birthday was an isolated incident rather than the culmination of years of neglect. "David, when did you last call me just to see how I was doing? Not because you needed something. Not because Lisa reminded you, but just because you wondered about your mother's life." He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "That's what I thought," I said. "Look, Mom, I get that you're upset, but this passive-aggressive stuff isn't helping anyone. If you have a problem with us, Just say so instead of sending cryptic messages. Passive-aggressive. I was being accused of passive-aggressive behavior by a man who'd spent years using my love against me, who manipulated my emotions to get what he wanted, who turned every conversation about my needs into a discussion of his convenience. "Okay," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have a problem with you." He blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct response. "You use me," I continued. "You call when you need a babysitter, when you need money, when you need someone to clean up your messes. But you don't call when I'm sick. You don't remember my birthday. You don't include me in your life unless I can provide some service." "That's not true. When was the last time you invited me to dinner at your house? When was the last time you asked about my health, my friends, my interests? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of a convenience?" David's face flushed red. "I don't have to listen to this. You're my mother, for God's sake. Helping family is what mothers do, and caring for family is what sons do," I replied. But apparently that's a one-way street. He stood up abruptly, his expensive suit wrinkled from sitting in my old armchair. "You know what? Maybe Lisa's right. Maybe you are having some kind of breakdown. Maybe we should look into getting you some help." The threat was clear. Step back in line, return to being the compliant mother who never complains, or face the consequences. They would declare me mentally incompetent, take control of my life completely. But something had changed in me over the past week. The silence had given me strength I didn't know I possessed. "If wanting to be treated with basic respect is a breakdown," I said, "then I guess I'm having one." David stared at me for a long moment, perhaps recognizing that the woman he'd taken for granted all these years was no longer available for exploitation. "Fine," he said finally. "Have your breakdown, but don't expect us to enable it." After he left, I sat in my living room and realized something profound. I wasn't afraid anymore. For years, the fear of losing them had controlled my every action. I'd swallowed my pride, ignored my needs, accepted their scraps of attention because I was terrified that standing up for myself would mean losing them completely. But the past week had shown me something liberating. I'd already lost them. The relationship I'd been fighting so desperately to preserve was an illusion. A one-sided arrangement where I gave everything and received nothing in return. That afternoon, I did something I'd been wanting to do for 15 years. I called my sister Margaret in Arizona. "Eleanor!" Her voice was warm, surprised, delighted. What a wonderful surprise. "How are you?" When was the last time someone had sounded genuinely happy to hear from me? I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think I might be figuring that out." We talked for 2 hours. Margaret told me about her art classes, her hiking group, the book club she'd joined where they discussed literature and drank wine and laughed until their sides ached. She described sunsets over the desert, weekend trips to small towns with quirky art galleries, the freedom of living life on her own terms. "I keep asking you to visit," she said. "The invitation is always open. Why don't you come out for a few weeks? Get some perspective." "I can't," I said automatically. "David might need—" I stopped mid-sentence, hearing myself. David might need what? A babysitter? Alone? Someone to clean up after him? When was the last time David had needed me for anything that actually mattered? "Actually," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth, "maybe I can." That evening I looked up flights to Phoenix. The prices were reasonable, and for the first time in years, I had discretionary income. No grandchild to buy gifts for, no last-minute financial emergencies to solve for my son, no requests for small loans that were never repaid. I booked a ticket for the following month, 2 weeks in Arizona with my sister, 2 weeks of living for myself instead of waiting for other people to need me. The next morning, my phone rang. Lisa's number. "Eleanor, I think we need to have a conversation," she said without preamble. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand." "What situation?" "You know exactly what situation. David told me about your conversation yesterday. Frankly, I'm concerned about your mental state." There it was again. The suggestion that wanting dignity and respect was a sign of mental illness. "I'm fine, Lisa. I'm actually better than I've been in years." "Well, that's good to hear. But I think you need to understand that your actions have consequences. We were planning to ask you to watch Tommy next weekend while we go to David's company retreat." But obviously, we can't trust you to be responsible right now. The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. She was threatening to take away my grandson's company that mostly consisted of him ignoring me while playing video games, as if it were a privilege rather than a service I provided. "That's fine," I said. Silence. "What do you mean that's fine?" "I mean it's fine. I have plans anyway." "Plans? What plans?" For the first time in my adult life, my weekend didn't revolve around their needs. I could sleep in, read a book, visit a museum, call an old friend. The possibilities felt endless. "My own plans," I said simply. "Eleanor, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this selfishness isn't attractive. Tommy is going to be disappointed. Then you should have thought of that before you used him as a weapon to manipulate me." I hung up before she could respond. That afternoon, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I cleaned out David's old bedroom, the room I'd kept as a shrine to his childhood, filled with trophies and photos and memorabilia from a boy who'd grown into a man I no longer recognized. I packed everything into boxes. The baseball glove I'd saved for 3 months to buy, the model airplanes we'd built together on rainy Sundays, the academic awards that had made me so proud. All of it went into storage containers labeled clearly with his name. By evening, the room was empty except for basic furniture. It looked larger somehow, full of possibility rather than nostalgia. I stood in the doorway and realized I wasn't grieving anymore. I was preparing. For what? I wasn't entirely sure. But for the first time in decades, the future felt like something I was creating rather than something that was happening to me. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in years. No phone by my bedside in case of emergency calls. No anxiety about what favor might be requested tomorrow. No guilt about disappointing people who'd made disappointing me an art form. Just peace. Just quiet. Just the profound relief of a woman who'd finally stopped trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. Outside my window, spring was turning to summer. The days were getting longer, warmer, full of light. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to tomorrow. 2 weeks before my planned trip to Arizona, they staged what they called an intervention. I was tending my garden, feeling the earth between my fingers, and thinking about how good it felt to plant something just for myself, when I heard multiple car doors slamming in my driveway. Through my kitchen window, I could see David, Lisa, and Tommy walking up my front path, but they weren't alone. Behind them came an elderly man I didn't recognize, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a briefcase that screamed authority. My hands were still dirty from gardening when I answered the door, and I felt oddly proud of that fact. For once, I hadn't dropped everything to make myself presentable for their convenience. "Mom," David said, not bothering with pleasantries. "We need to talk. This is Robert Henley, our family attorney, a lawyer." They'd brought a lawyer to my home. The message was clear. This wasn't a family discussion. This was a legal proceeding. "Mrs. Matthews," the attorney said, extending his hand, "I represent your son's interests. May we come in?" I looked at Tommy, standing behind his parents with confusion written across his 8-year-old face. Whatever they were planning to do, they were forcing him to witness it. "Of course," I said, stepping aside. We gathered in my living room, and I noticed how they arranged themselves. David and Lisa on the couch, the lawyer in my favorite armchair, Tommy perched uncertainly on the edge of the ottoman. I was left standing in my own home, like a defendant awaiting judgment. "Mrs. Matthews," the lawyer began, opening his briefcase and withdrawing several documents. "Your family has expressed concerns about your recent behavior. They're worried about your mental state and your ability to live independently." I felt the familiar flutter of panic in my chest but pushed it down. "What concerns?" David leaned forward. "Mom, you've been acting strange. The calendar thing was weird enough, but now you're refusing to help with Tommy. You're being hostile to Lisa, and frankly, we're worried you're having some kind of breakdown." "A breakdown?" I repeated. "Because I sent you a calendar marking my forgotten birthday?" "It's more than that," Lisa said, her voice sharp. "You've been completely selfish lately. You refused to watch Tommy last weekend without any explanation. You hung up on me when I tried to discuss it rationally. You're isolating yourself from family." The lawyer nodded gravely. "These can be signs of cognitive decline, Mrs. Matthews. Your family is trying to help you. I looked at Tommy, who was staring at his hands. Tommy, sweetheart, why don't you go to the kitchen and get yourself a cookie from the jar? He can stay, David said firmly. This affects him too. This is adult business, I replied, my voice steady. Tommy, cookies are in the blue jar. Take as many as you want. He glanced at his parents, then at me, and must have heard something in my tone that made him obey. After he left, I turned back to the 3 adults who'd invaded my home to judge my sanity. Now, I said, still standing, what exactly are you proposing? The lawyer cleared his throat. Your son has petitioned the court to grant him guardianship over your affairs. Given your recent erratic behavior and your age, it would ensure you receive proper care and supervision. Guardianship. They wanted to take away my legal right to make my own decisions, to control my money, my home, my medical care, my life, all because I'd finally said no to being used. Erratic behavior, I repeated. Such as? David pulled out his phone and began reading from what was obviously a prepared list. Sending threatening messages to family members, refusing to participate in family obligations, exhibiting signs of paranoia and persecution complex, becoming increasingly hostile and unreasonable. Each word was carefully chosen to make me sound unstable. My calendar had become threatening messages. My boundaries had become refusal to participate. My self-respect had become paranoia. I see, I said quietly. And who determined that these behaviors indicate mental incompetence? It's obvious to anyone who knows you, Lisa said. The Eleanor we know would never act this way. She'd never put her own wants above family needs. There it was. The real issue wasn't my mental health. It was my refusal to continue being the selfless martyr who sacrificed everything for people who gave nothing in return. You're right, I said. The Eleanor you knew would never have acted this way. But maybe the Eleanor you knew was afraid. Maybe she was so terrified of losing her family that she let them abuse her generosity until there was nothing left. Nobody abused anything, David said, his face reddening. We're family. Family helps each other. When was the last time you helped me, David? Silence. When was the last time you called to check on my health? When was the last time you offered to help with my yard work, my grocery shopping, my household repairs? When was the last time you gave me anything without expecting something larger in return? The lawyer was taking notes, but his expression had shifted from professional concern to something closer to uncomfortable recognition. Mrs. Matthews, he said carefully, your family says you've been making unreasonable financial demands. I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. What financial demands? David shifted uncomfortably. You've been hostile about money, acting like we owe you something. You do owe me something. $37,000 in unpaid loans over the past 5 years. Would you like to see the receipts? I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder I'd been keeping, the one filled with bank statements and canceled checks and IOU notes that were never honored. I spread them across the coffee table like evidence in a trial. Here's the $5,000 for your car repair, David. Here's the $3,000 for Lisa's dental work. Here's the $1,500 for Tommy's summer camp, the $2,000 for your anniversary trip, the $8,000 for your kitchen renovation. The papers told the story of a woman who'd been systematically drained by people who'd learned to see her bank account as their personal emergency fund. The lawyer examined the documents, his eyebrows rising with each receipt. These are substantial amounts. All of them promised to be repaid, I said. None of them ever were, but apparently, expecting my own money back makes me mentally incompetent. Lisa's face was flushed. Those weren't loans. That was family helping family. Funny how family helping family only goes one direction, I replied. I don't recall you ever offering to help when my roof leaked last winter, or when my car needed repairs, or when I was sick for a week and couldn't leave the house. That's different, David said. You're our mother. You're supposed to help us. And you're my son. What are you supposed to do for me? The question hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose it was. From the kitchen came the sound of Tommy quietly eating cookies, unaware that his family was trying to have his grandmother declared incompetent for the crime of refusing to be exploited any longer. The lawyer closed his briefcase. Mrs. Matthews, I think there may have been some misunderstanding about your situation. Based on what I've seen today, I don't believe a guardianship petition would be successful. David's face went pale. What do you mean? I mean, your mother appears to be mentally competent, financially responsible, and capable of making her own decisions. Wanting to be treated with respect isn't a sign of cognitive decline. He stood up, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I'll be in touch about my fee for today's consultation. After he left, we sat in silence. David and Lisa looked stunned, as if they couldn't believe their carefully orchestrated plan had collapsed so completely. I want you both to leave now, I said quietly. Mom? David started. Leave. Take Tommy and go. And don't come back until you're ready to treat me like a human being instead of a resource to be managed. You can't be serious, Lisa said. I'm completely serious. You brought a lawyer to my home to try to take away my legal rights because I refuse to continue being your unpaid servant. That tells me everything I need to know about what I mean to you. They gathered their things in stunned silence. At the door, David turned back. Mom, if you change your mind, I won't, I said. 68 years is long enough to wait for my own family to love me. I'm done waiting. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and realized something profound. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was relieved. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free. The flight to Phoenix left Chicago on a crisp October morning, the kind of day when autumn air carries the promise of winter, but still holds the memory of summer warmth. As the plane lifted off, I pressed my face to the small window and watched my city shrink below me, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, the pure joy of possibility. Margaret was waiting for me at the airport, her face glowing with Arizona sunshine and genuine happiness. At 71, she looked younger than I felt at 68. Her silver hair was cut in a stylish bob. She wore turquoise jewelry that caught the light, and her smile held no shadows of resentment or obligation. Eleanor, she called, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming home. You look wonderful. Different. There's something in your eyes that wasn't there last time I saw you. I knew what she meant. The last time we'd been together was at our mother's funeral 3 years ago, when I'd been so consumed with managing David's needs and schedules that I'd barely had time to grieve. That woman felt like a stranger to me now. Margaret's house was a small adobe cottage painted in warm terracotta, surrounded by a garden of succulents and desert flowers that required no constant tending, no desperate need for approval. Wind chimes made of glass and metal caught the desert breeze, creating music that had no purpose except beauty. It's perfect, I said, and meant it. It's mine, she replied, and I understood the profound difference between those two statements. The first week passed like a dream I was afraid to wake from. We hiked gentle trails through desert landscapes that stretched to horizons unbroken by anything but sky. Margaret introduced me to her hiking group, women in their 60s and 70s who moved through the world with confidence and purpose, who planned trips and pursued hobbies and lived entirely for themselves without apology. Eleanor used to be a wonderful cook, Margaret told her friends over lunch at a small cafe that served Mexican food so authentic it made my taste buds sing. She probably still is when she has time to cook for herself instead of ungrateful family members. The comment was casual, but it hit me like revelation. When was the last time I'd cooked something I wanted to eat? For years, my kitchen had been a service station, producing David's favorite meals and Lisa's dietary requirements, and whatever would make Tommy stop complaining. I'd forgotten that food could be pleasure rather than obligation. That evening, Margaret and I cooked together for the first time since we were teenagers. She taught me to make authentic salsa verde, showing me how to char the tomatillos until their skins blistered and their flesh became sweet and smoky. We drank wine while we cooked, laughing at stories from our childhood, remembering the girls we used to be before life taught us to make ourselves smaller. I want to show you something, Margaret said after dinner, leading me to a small room off her kitchen that she'd converted into an art studio. The walls were covered with paintings, landscapes, still lifes, abstract pieces that exploded with color and emotion. These are yours? I asked, though the answer was obvious from the signature in the corner of each canvas. I started painting 2 years after Harold died, she said. I'd always wanted to try, but there was never time. Too busy being a wife, a mother, a caretaker. Then one day I realized I was finally free to be myself. I studied her paintings, seeing in them a journey from hesitant experimentation to confident self-expression. The later works were bold, uncompromising, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with pleasing anyone else. "I never knew you were artistic," I said. "Neither did I. Turns out, when you stop living for other people's approval, you discover parts of yourself you never knew existed." That night, lying in Margaret's guest room under a skylight that revealed more stars than I'd ever seen from my Chicago neighborhood, I thought about the woman I'd been for 68 years versus the woman I was beginning to become. For the first time since my forgotten birthday, I wasn't angry. I was curious. What else had I buried beneath decades of selfless service? What dreams had I abandoned because they didn't serve someone else's needs? What parts of Eleanor Matthews had been sacrificed to create the perfect mother, the reliable grandmother, the woman who never said no? The next morning, Margaret took me to a pottery studio where she took weekly classes. "Just try it," she said, guiding my hands to the wheel. "Don't worry about making something perfect. Just feel the clay and see what happens." The clay was cool and responsive under my fingers, transforming as I touched it. I had no idea what I was making. No plan or purpose except the simple pleasure of creation. Under the instructor's gentle guidance, something that might have been a bowl began to emerge, lopsided and imperfect, but undeniably mine. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, and I realized she was right. Not because it was technically skilled or aesthetically perfect, but because it existed. Because I had made something that served no one's needs but my own, that would sit on my shelf and remind me that I was capable of creating rather than just giving. 2 weeks in Arizona became 3. Margaret didn't pressure me to extend my stay, but she didn't mention my departure date either. We fell into routines that belonged to no one but us. Morning coffee on the patio watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. Afternoon walks through neighborhoods where people actually talk to each other. Evening discussions about books and movies and ideas that had nothing to do with family obligation. I called David once, more out of habit than desire. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. "How's your vacation?" he asked, the word vacation carrying a subtle criticism, as if taking time for myself was self-indulgent rather than necessary. "I'm having a wonderful time," I said. "When are you coming back?" The question felt like a trap. Not "we miss you" or "we're looking forward to seeing you," but a demand for my return timeline, as if my absence was inconvenient rather than instructive. "I'm not sure yet," I said, and felt a thrill of freedom at admitting it. "Mom, you can't just disappear indefinitely. Tommy asks about you." The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. Tommy, who complained that my house smelled like old people, was suddenly concerned about my absence. "Tell Tommy I love him," I said. "And David? I'm not disappearing. I'm discovering." That afternoon, Margaret and I were sitting by her pool, reading in comfortable silence, when she asked the question I'd been avoiding. "What are you going to do when you go back?" I'd been dreading this moment, the inevitable return to reality, but as I sat in the Arizona sunshine, feeling truly relaxed for the first time in years, I realized something profound. I didn't have to go back to the life I'd left. I could go back to Chicago, but I didn't have to return to being the same woman who'd boarded that plane 3 weeks ago. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I know I can't go back to the way things were, but I don't know what comes next." Margaret nodded. "You know, there's a little house for sale 2 blocks from here. 1 bedroom, small yard, perfect for someone who wants to start over." The suggestion hung in the air like a possibility I'd never dared consider. Leave Chicago entirely? Leave the house where I'd raised David? The neighborhood where I'd lived for 34 years? The city that held all my memories? "I couldn't," I said automatically. "My life is in Chicago." "What life?" Margaret asked gently. "A house that holds more painful memories than happy ones. A family that takes but never gives. A routine built around other people's needs." She was right, and we both knew it. My life in Chicago wasn't a life at all. It was a collection of obligations and disappointments held together by habit and fear. That evening, we drove to see the house. It was small and simple, painted the same warm terracotta as Margaret's cottage. with a garden that could accommodate vegetables and flowers chosen for beauty rather than utility. The kitchen had windows that looked out onto mountains that changed color with the light, and the bedroom had that same skylight that revealed the vast desert night sky. Standing in that empty house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the possibility of home that belonged entirely to me. "I could see you here," Margaret said softly. "I could see you painting in that back bedroom, cooking meals you actually want to eat, making friends who choose your company rather than your services." That night, I called the real estate agent. 3 days later, I made an offer on the house. It was accepted the same afternoon. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself first. Not out of anger or spite or revenge, but out of love. Love for the woman I'd been before I learned to disappear. Love for the woman I was becoming. Love for the life I could build when I stopped trying to earn it from people who were incapable of giving it freely. The rebirth wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, beautiful in its simplicity, like watching the sun rise over the desert, painting the world in colors I'd forgotten existed, reminding me that every day offers the possibility of beginning again. I was Eleanor Matthews, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. 1 year later, I woke up in my small adobe house to the sound of desert wind chimes and the sight of mountains painted gold by the rising sun. The skylight above my bed framed a piece of Arizona sky so vast and blue it still took my breath away. Even after 12 months of mornings that belonged entirely to me, my coffee tasted different here. Not because the beans were special, but because I drank it in peace, without checking my phone for emergency requests or planning someone else's day while neglecting my own needs. I sat on my back patio, watching hummingbirds visit the native flowers I'd planted with my own hands, and marveled at how quiet contentment could feel after decades of manufactured chaos. The mailman, Jose, waved as he delivered letters that were actually for me, catalogs for art supplies, invitations to community events, correspondence from my hiking group, no bills I couldn't pay, no legal documents threatening to take away my security, no certified letters designed to destroy what little stability I'd managed to build. "Beautiful morning, Mrs. Matthews," Jose called out. He knew my name not because I was useful to him, but because we'd had genuine conversations about his daughter's college plans and his wife's volunteer work at the animal shelter. "The most beautiful," I replied, meaning it completely. That afternoon, I drove to the community center where I'd started volunteering 6 months earlier. The Second Act program helped women over 50 navigate major life transitions: divorce, widowhood, empty nest syndrome, or simply the realization that they'd spent decades living for everyone except themselves. Today's group included 8 women ranging from 55 to 78, each carrying her own story of awakening. There was Carmen, who'd left her controlling husband after 32 years and was learning to drive for the first time. Patricia had started college at 70, pursuing the English degree she'd abandoned when her children were young. Mary Ellen had opened a small bakery with money she'd saved in secret for 15 years. "Eleanor," said Jennifer, our newest member who was still shaking from the aftermath of her own family's betrayal, "I need to ask you something." Jennifer's story was heartbreakingly familiar. 40 years of marriage to a man who'd convinced her she was worthless. 2 adult children who saw her as a free babysitting service. Decades of sacrifice that had been repaid with contempt and abandonment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Leaving everything behind? Starting over so late in life?" I considered her question carefully. Did I regret choosing myself over the illusion of family that had been slowly destroying me? Did I miss the constant anxiety of never being enough for people who would never be satisfied? "I regret how long it took me to value myself," I said. "I regret the years I wasted waiting for people to love me the way I loved them. But leaving? Starting over? Those are the best decisions I ever made." The women nodded with understanding that comes only from shared experience. We'd all learned that it's never too late to save yourself, even from the people you love most. After group, I stopped at the grocery store where Mrs. Chen, the owner, greeted me like the neighbor I'd become, rather than the customer I appeared to be. "Eleanor, how are the painting classes going?" I'd started taking watercolor lessons 3 months ago. discovering at 69 that I had artistic abilities I'd never explored. My paintings were amateur but joyful, hanging in my living room not because they were masterpieces, but because they were mine. "Wonderful," I said. "I'm working on a desert landscape that may or may not resemble the actual desert, but it makes me happy." She laughed. "That's what matters. Happiness first, perfection never." That evening, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and I felt nothing. Not the familiar flutter of anxiety, not the desperate hope that maybe this time would be different. Just curiosity about what he might want. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that careful politeness he'd adopted since our last confrontation. "Hello, David. How are you?" "Good. Fine. Tommy made honor roll again." "That's wonderful. Please tell him I'm proud of him." A pause. These conversations had become exercises in cautious civility. Neither of us quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic, where I wasn't available for emotional or financial exploitation. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said. About us not appreciating you. About taking you for granted." I waited, saying nothing. "Lisa and we think maybe we could do better. Be better. If you wanted to come back for Christmas, we could try to show you how much you mean to us." The offer hung in the air between us. A year ago, I would have cried with gratitude, would have booked a flight immediately, would have begun planning how to serve their happiness during my visit. "I appreciate that, David," I said gently, "but I have plans for Christmas." "Plans?" "Margaret and I are spending the holidays in Santa Fe. There's an art museum she wants to visit, and I've never seen Christmas luminarias in the snow." Silence. David was processing the reality that his mother had a life that didn't revolve around his family's needs, plans that didn't include him, priorities that put her own happiness first. "Oh," he said finally. "Well, maybe sometime after the holidays." "Maybe," I said. "David, I want you to know that I love you. I always will. But I love myself now too. And that means I won't go back to being the woman who accepted crumbs and called them love." After I hung up, I sat in my living room and looked at the terrible watercolor painting hanging above my couch. It depicted a desert sunset in colors that existed nowhere in nature, with mountains that defied geography and clouds that seemed to be falling rather than floating. It was the most beautiful thing in my house, because it represented something I'd never had before: the freedom to create something imperfect and love it anyway. 3 months later, on March 8th, my 70th birthday, I woke up to messages from my hiking group, my art class friends, my volunteer colleagues, and Margaret. People who remembered because they cared, not because they needed something from me. I spent the day exactly as I wanted: painting in the morning, hiking with friends in the afternoon, dinner at my favorite Mexican restaurant where the owner brought me flan with a candle because he'd noticed it was my special day. That evening, as I sat on my patio watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago. She felt like someone from a past life, someone I'd known intimately, but had outgrown completely. The heartbreak had been real. The loneliness had been devastating. The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. But sometimes the greatest heartbreak leads to the most unbelievable transformation. I lost my family, yes. But I found myself, and that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could have given the little girl who'd grown up believing her worth depended on how much she could give away. Have you ever lived through something like this? Or do you know someone who has? Let me know in the comments below. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel so this message can reach someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that it's never too late to choose ourselves first.